Reggie, let's talk about changing the story then.
Okay.
What do you mean when you say change the narrative?
The narrative is the story that we are living into, whether or not we can even articulate that story or not. The power of narrative is underestimated. I'll give you a personal example, a biblical example, that I think that way our leaders can and the people that are listening in can get it. You see, I contend that Saul, the first king of Israel, never saw himself as king. And he lived into that narrative. I mean, the kingdom was ultimately taken from him. Now, he had everything in the world going for him, apparently. You know, he was tall, he was athletic, he had a good family pedigree, he was charismatic, on and on and on. But he had to be drafted, they reluctantly into being king, as we know from that story. And I'll tell you, when Samuel goes to him and to deliver the message that the kingdom was being taken from him, when he starts quoting God, here's what God says through the prophet to Saul. First word, Saul, though you were small in your own eyes, I made you king. Now that's interesting. Saul never saw himself as king, and he lived into it. David, on the other hand, no one saw him as king. But his internal narrative, you know what David's favorite phrase to describe himself in the Psalms is the Lord's anointed. Well, if that's the story that's running in your head, well, where did you get that? Well, it's from when Gandalf showed up, at his dad's house. Samuel, I think Gandalf's a great picture for where did he come from and then he disappears and what's he up to, and he just shows up and people start quaking. So Samuel comes to Jesse's house and says, "Yeah, I'm looking for the king of Israel. I'm going to anoint the king." And all the sons come. I mean, how would you like to grow up listening to the fact that your own dad, couldn't even come up with you as first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and Samuel keeps going. Jesse, I'm just not getting the email here. I mean, this are all your sons? Well, no, we got the kid out back practicing to be a rock star. Well, well, bring him in, And so Samuel anoints David, and even though no one else saw him in that role, he lived into the Lord's anointed narrative. Well, to move that now to a corporate, and by the way, when I coach individuals, and even church teams, but let's stay with individuals for a minute. Because of that, I'll ask folks, tell me a movie, tell me a book, tell me a Broadway play, TV show, something that's common that we would know that describes your life or your ministry. It's a quick read on when people tell me. And usually individuals will give me a collage, well, I'm a little bit like this, I'm a little bit. Well, that tells me what's going on in their brain, the story that they're living out in their mind. I asked church leaders and teams the same thing. I can remember when I asked one church, 6 out of 7 of their executive leadership team said Titanic. I mean, you don't have to be particularly prescient as a consultant to know we got us a problem here. Everybody here is looking for a lifeboat. Ain't nobody looking to turn this ship around. But that's the power of narrative. Because we live into that. Well, okay, so if we think that the story that we're living out is about building a great church so that people will turn to God, forget it. I mean, that's a narrative that's going to lead you down into making all kinds of wrong choices or, inadequate choices. But if you think your story is, we are here to point people to a great God, and and to tell his story, and to make sure people have access to the life that God intends for, that God is for them. This was Jesus' message. This is why it was such a welcome relief compared to the message they were getting from the Pharisees, who largely had control of the synagogues, or from the Sadducees, who looked down their long noses because they had the God on their side because they had position and influence. So you put plebes out there, forget it. I mean, Jesus' message was such a I think sometimes we don't read it like that. I mean, we've forgotten that it's good news. And Jesus preached the good news, not the good news of the gospel. Yeah, I mean, I grew up with evangelicals. It's like the gospel of the gospel. No, it's the good news of the kingdom. It's not the gospel of the church. Good news of the kingdom. Life. God is here for you.
Well, and I think story is such a power tool on its own. I mean, it's so much the way our brain works.
Yes.
So much the way our culture works. Our culture doesn't want facts, and commercials aren't, here's Colgate toothpaste and the 3 reasons why. It's a story.
Yeah.
And it's always been strange to me that I read the Bible and it's story.
Yeah.
Even Numbers is the book about how we got the numbers. It's a story.
Yeah.
Like somewhere along the way, it stopped for us in the Enlightenment somewhere. We don't even think of it as a story. We sing, "This is my story, this is my," but we don't think of it like a story, and we don't see what we do as story. It's doctrinal statements. It's these truths that we have to protect.
Formulas for living.
Yeah.
Instead of stories to illuminate life, we're consumed with the formula or whatever. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think we've got to start approaching these things as story, and I think we can do that in our preaching and in a lot of the ways we approach Scripture. And then but how do you start to then reshape the story of churches?
Well, so every client that I work with in hand-to-hand combat, where we're thinking through everything, I say, let's go to your website. What story are you sending out? Because trust me, you're telegraphing. Sorry for that old thing. You're streaming a story about what your church really believes. I was working with one client, and I had them. They had these testimonials on their homepage about why this was such a great church. And God got mentioned once, Jesus not at all, out of the 2 stories, but a lot of customer service stuff got, the food's great, and the worship team's fabulous, so we love the music, and the preaching's really good, and the valet parking, I couldn't believe. I mean, this is no different from just a club, telling about why they like to be there. But so I say, let's start with your what are you saying? Your business. What business are you in? Let's go to church now. In your gatherings, how can you? And I mean, it's just simple stuff. It's like every one of my clients will at least have once a month, they'll have a community leader that they interview. I mean, I grew up in a church where we prayed that God would, blind us to what's going on around us so we could focus on Him during the worship service. And I could just see God turning conniptions. I don't want you to lose sight of the world. That's why I came, for crying out loud. That's your job. You got all eternity. We'll get around to this other, but pay attention. You're in the world. Pay attention. Not of it. Pay attention. So interviewing the school chief or the police chief or the mayor or city council person or a high school guidance counselor or a health social worker, bringing those just to keep in front of the church and then pray for them, or I like what a friend of mine does. That's bringing the church, but how about the flip side? Our own folks who are there, and the way he honors that is he has this moment in his service that's called 24 hours from now. And he brings somebody up, and they know this is happening, this is not sprung on them. And, and he asks them just some basic, 24 hours from now, where are you going to be? I'll be in a classroom, I'll be, teaching, or I'm showing folks, or I'm a whatever. And then, it's a great, and then he says, well, where do you see God at work in there? And then how can you bring God into, oh my gosh, you see what that does is that automatically says, this is not the point. The game's out there. I mean, another image I use hub and airport. Another one is game and halftime. You don't play a game so you can have halftime. I mean, you have halftime so you can play a better game, and so, what kind of crazy thing would it be? We're losing the game, but boy, we had a great halftime.
Yeah.
I mean, you should have heard the coach's story. Are you kidding? So telling those, just what we emphasize in our gatherings. Then let's go to the leaders' meetings. How many elder meetings or session meetings or all that? we never get to outside the church. It's all church stuff. The air conditioner on the third floor is rumbling, and we got some people are upset, because they didn't get their bulletin. Whatever. The font changed. Why in the world?
Some of those sounded particular.
Sorry. But, I just go nuts with this stuff. So why in the world don't we start with the community, since that's our assignment, the kingdom. And if we got any leftover energy, then fool around with the church stuff. But, elders and session leaders and all have a bad habit of coming and then trying to make up a reason to be there, and they start poking around on stuff, and then pastors get worried. But start the meeting with. In fact, all my clients, I even challenge them to, if they can, to have a project in the community they're working on together.
Yeah.
That keeps the main thing the main thing. Those are some ways, practical ways.
Because for churches, they are already living a story.
Yes.
They're already showing it in the session agenda, in the insider language we use in church, in the way we do church exactly the same every time. We are communicating something about why we're here.
Yes.
And so part of what the church has to do is look at that and say, well, what story are we living? Is that the story we should be living?
Yes. And we're telling a story about God.
Yeah.
Is God made, is salvation mostly about, fixing sin, the sin problem, or is it a release to life?
Yeah.
That's so powerful, the difference. If God is trying to fix you, or if God celebrates you. Now, which one? Which as a parent, we know the difference that comes across to our children. Why don't we evaluate the story of God that we're presenting?
And then we wonder why new people don't want to be a part of our boring story. Young people don't want to be a part of our,
Yes.
If our story is we really miss the 1960s or the 1990s.
When can we get back together?
Not everybody wants to be. That's not an engaging story that people want to be a part of.
No.
And they know it when they walk in.
Now, Jordan, that brings up something that it's interesting, because when God wants to change the story in a big way, he'll use a natural catastrophe like a COVID pandemic, or he'll change the generational, the values of an entire generational cohort. So we have millennials coming along, and everybody's now talking about the millennials. Well, pay attention. Because the culture didn't set their values. Those values, they had cultural experiences that highlighted and helped shape that. Mm-hmm. But, the church didn't set those values for those millennials. But pay attention, because look what they are interested in. Community, service. It's exactly the way, if I were, if you wanted to shift the church emphasis, you'd send a whole new generation in that say, we need to serve our communities. That's how we're authentic. Pay attention to that. That's critical.